Welcome, everybody. Thanks for giving us the time to come and spend a few minutes with you just to talk about psychological safety as a foundation for improvement. And our aims today really are to give a better understanding of what psychological safety is, some of the barriers and enablers that we might experience in the workplace, some impacts on patient care, what would be effective communication feedback, what the leadership's role is in cultivating psychological safety, and also sharing a few examples of what good looks like from our perspective. But recognizing, I think, before we start that we can only really scratch the surface of this topic today. It's multidimensional. But if you want to read more, we'd both really suggest these two as starting points. It's where it all really started from a research perspective. It's Amy Edmondson's book, The Fearless Organisation, and her original 1999 paper on psychological safety, and we'll be touching on these quite a bit throughout the presentation. So myself and Pete will be talking today specifically about psychological safety in the context of improvement activity and change in the workplace, and how psychological safety, it really is the foundation for improvement. When we talk about psychology, we are kind of by definition thinking about thinking and decision making in human beings. And it's human beings that affect change. So our starting point should be the people that we work with. And we both believe that, as Richard Branson states here, that if you look after your staff, they'll look after your customers, patients, family members. It is as simple as that. And this is a model I've been sort of playing around with, so it's not really fully formed at the moment, but hopefully it sort of captures some of the levels that we may or may not think about when we approach improvement activity. We often focus our attention on outcomes. Sometimes we may look at the process, but rarely is our starting point from the people involved in the work. And those people could be staff or patients or carers or loved ones, but really understanding the environment that exists for those people. And as I said before, ultimately it is people that affect change. And maybe our starting point should be the people in the systems first, rather than purely the outcomes. The outcome give us the motivations, the drivers, but maybe that isn't always the starting point. So what we hope to be able to share today, as Lewin posits, that the understanding and learning which the process produces for individuals and groups is more important than any change as such. And the way I've translated that is that the way we go about change is more important than the change itself. But sometimes we only ever really focus on the change, or as John Cotter puts it here, change sticks, where it just becomes just the way we do things around here. So when we're thinking about understanding psychological safety in itself, I think it's really important to remember that psychological safety in itself is not something to work on its own. It exists because of other actions taken or the environment that's been created by you as individuals and us as leaders. It surrounds us, become normalized to the point of almost invisibility. We shouldn't always really recognize it's there. It should just become part and parcel of what we do. But only individuals can determine that psychological safety exists. It's not for us as leaders to endorse that on people, or to give that to other people. They have to feel psychologically safe in themselves. And that point that psychological safety is everywhere, or maybe everywhere, by definition, it kind of becomes part of the organizational team culture. So as Shine states here, the only thing of real importance that leaders do is create and manage culture. If you don't manage culture, it manages you, and you may not even be aware of the extent that this is happening. So just swap the word culture there for psychological safety, and I still think that statement there reads the same. So as we understand a bit more about psychological safety, a bit more about culture, and we understand culture a bit more, most of the modern literature on psychological safety is based on the work of Shine and Warren Bennis, Warren Kahn. And Shine describes culture as a pattern of shared basic assumptions learned by a group as it solved its problems of external adaptation and internal integration, which has worked well enough to be considered valid, and therefore to be taught to new members as the correct way to perceive, think, and feel in relation to those problems. I just want to extract a few key lines out of that, but I think we describe it more, is that pattern of shared basic assumptions learned by a group. This is culture, this is psychological safety, to be taught to new members as the correct way to perceive, think, or feel. And again, like Cotter said, that may be for good or bad. It just becomes the way that we do things around here. So going back to that, as I mentioned before, we're going back to the original source of what we think about when we talk about psychological safety. This brings us to Amy Edmondson and the work that she's done, so much amazing research in this field. And as I mentioned before, a good place to start if you want to learn more, pick up this book. Um, there's so much information in here that will be really helpful, and particularly the influence on learning and innovation and how psychological safety, that real basis for learning and innovation in the workplace. Edmondson describes psychological safety as the belief that one will not be punished or humiliated for speaking up with ideas, questions, concerns, or mistakes, and the team is safe for interpersonal risk taking. But remember that only, as I said before, only the individual can define if there's psychological safety. It's their interpretation, irrespective of what we as leaders might think. So when we think about what that looks like, what kind of environment, and we may or may not have seen some of these environments, we may have worked in some of these environments. What does psychological danger look like for people? What does a psychologically unsafe environment look like? And that's an environment where there's a fear of making mistakes. There's an uncertainty. There's that risk. We don't try anything new because it's that fear of getting blamed, or we end up blaming others. And therefore, as we do that, we're less likely to share different perspectives and different views. We don't put our heads up over the parapet. We just keep ourselves to ourselves. Nothing new happens, and that results in that common knowledge effect that this is just what we do around here. This is just how things happen, and we don't challenge that. We don't offer different perspectives. But if we look at the flip of that, and what does a psychologically safe work environment look like? And is that comfort in admitting mistakes, being able to try something out, knowing that we can say that we got it wrong, or we can try something new, and learning from that failure, learning from treating failure as a learning opportunity, and going again, not feeling like we have to prove ourselves all the time, and being vulnerable to the idea that we may make mistakes and there may be failure. That results in everybody feeling able to open to share ideas, share their thoughts, challenge, offer different perspectives, and that does lead ultimately to better innovation and decision making. We get new ideas and we get freshness to our work environments, and again, that cycle continues. And these four domains of psychological safety that is detailed from some of the research we understand about attitude to risk and failure. We've just touched on that openness to the conversation, but it's also about expanding that to this willingness to help. We understand it's not just about us. We work better as a collective and as a team. How do we help other people in that environment? How do we bring in different perspectives, the inclusivity, diversity, not just from the individuals involved, but the diversity of thoughts, different backgrounds? That creates a psychologically safe environment. And a key feature of that workplace is that it's very much a learning environment where those in that environment understand what's expected of them and others. Accountability is a good thing and not just a stick to beat people with. We can see from this matrix here that in the low psychological safety and high accountability, that lands us right in that anxiety zone. And possibly many of us have experienced that, where we don't feel psychologically safe, but there is high accountability. And what we're looking for is that high motivation, high accountability, high psychological safety, and puts us very much in that learning zone. You sometimes find that some teams have high psychological safety, but low motivation and accountability. And there we find ourselves coasting a little bit in that comfort zone. So as we move a little bit in terms of from the apathy into comfort and learning, what we don't want is creating an environment where people feel high levels of anxiety because we have that low levels of psychological safety. And this link between psychological safety and learning behaviour is drawn very much out in the research from Edmondson's original 1999 paper. And she states that engaging in that learning behaviour in a team is highly dependent on team psychological safety. The implication of this results is that people's beliefs are about how others will respond if they engage in behaviour for which the outcome is uncertain, which affects their willingness to take interpersonal risks. This fast-paced work environment that we all exist in requires learning behaviour to make sense of what is happening as well as to take action. That pause possibly to allow us to think. The need to ask questions, seek help, tolerate mistakes in the face of uncertainty while team members and other colleagues watch is probably more prevalent today than ever before. And this point before this here about tolerating mistakes in the face of uncertainty while other people watch, particularly people who are our colleagues, is really important, and how we create that environment for that to exist. So as you think about some of the barriers and enablers, possibly pop some of your thoughts in the chat. What are your thoughts around some of the barriers and enablers to psychological safety? Maybe they'll match some of our thoughts as we move through, but it'd be interesting to get your perspectives. As a starter, I think for me, one of the avoid the temptation to make a thing of psychological safety. Don't make it a project or a campaign or initiative. You see, there's often a focus on the thing in itself. As leaders, it's the environment that matters more. And as this quote here says, if you make a bad cake, you can cover it with beautiful icing, but it's still a bad cake. To remember that psychological safety exists because of the existence of many other different conditions, and it's not necessarily a thing in itself. And some of those conditions are quite tangible. Edmondson says here, for knowledge work to flourish, the workplace must be one where people feel able to share their knowledge. This means sharing concerns, questions, mistakes, kind of half-formed ideas. These are really tangible elements of a psychologically safe environment. And we often exist and find ourselves in steep hierarchical structures, but when we flatten that power gradient, we create a culture where it is safe to speak up. But David Marquet, who's an ex-submarine commander in the US Navy, he says people are afraid to speak truth to power, and we see it all the time. Steep power gradients inhibit information flows. When we flatten the power gradient, we create a culture where it is safe for everyone to share ideas, ask questions, and voice concerns. Or to go back to that original definition by Edmondson, the belief that one will not be punished or humiliated for speaking up with ideas, questions, concerns, or mistakes, and the team is safe for that interpersonal risk taking. But remember, repeat the point that I made before, that it is only the individual can define it's psychologically safe, not us as leaders. We can't give that to other people. So when we think about that learning culture that we can create an environment for psychological safety to exist, we often think about how much of that fear of failure that it inhibits us and stops those change happening. But failure can be a good thing, as Henry Ford puts it here. Failure is simply the opportunity to begin again, this time more intelligently. How do we learn from past experience? Not just writing things off, saying, oh, it didn't work, let's just move on, but recognizing what has worked and what didn't work, but learning from that and treating that as a good thing. But we're conditioned from an early age to avoid ridicule as we grow up, especially in those awkward teenage years. We do anything to avoid being made fun of, and this really does stay with us built into our psyche into adulthood. And especially when the workplace doesn't provide that safe place to try and fail. But for improvement and change to exist, by definition, we have to try something new. As Einstein says here, a person who never made a mistake never tried anything new. And as leaders, we can create a learning environment by establishing a mindset that we don't have all the answers. Adam Grant, in his book Think Again, really stresses this point, that if we understand our knowledge gaps, we can create a learning and experimentation without that experiment impacting on our professional egos. We're humble enough to accept that we don't know everything, and we can portray that, and we can give that environment and a workplace environment to other people. So a question I'll often ask teams and individuals that I'm working with: if you think you're right, how do you know? Because we can get into these overconfident cycles of certainty, that pride in we're the ones who have all the answers, we're the solutionizers, and we have a conviction, the courage of our conviction, and we have to follow that through. And that results in an element of confirmation bias, desirability biases, because we have to prove ourselves, that validation to demonstrate that we're doing a great job and we're the ones with all the answers. But engaging in this rethinking cycle of humility, doubt, certain curiosity, discovery, we're moving into that real proper, true scientific thinking, which favours humility over pride, as Grant says here, doubt over certainty, curiosity over closure. But when we shift out of that scientist mode into the rethinking cycle breaks down, and it does give way to those overconfident cycles. So creating a mindset that we're open to uncertainty, curiosity, discovery, it does create the work environment where people feel able to contribute to that and breaks down that echo chamber element. So there are some significant enablers to a psychologically safe work environment in the way that we lead improvement and change activity. In a book, Teaming, Edmondson asks, do we organise to learn or do we organise to execute? That means when we plan change or plan improvement work, are we planning that, organising that, expecting to learn as we go? Or are we fully working it through in a solutionising kind of way to impose that change on other people, organised to execute it? Then when we're in that execution phase, are we still willing and open to learn as we go? recognizing that we can't know everything to start off with? Or do we execute for efficiency, execute and deliver and impose and do to in the shortest timescales possible, thinking that we have this fully formed solution and we're going to deliver it? Balancing off this idea that we're in a learning environment means that we're always open to new suggestions and new ideas, and people feel able to speak up and offer their perspectives. So as we move into the thinking about how does this all impact on patient care, ultimately we can create a wonderful workplace for our people. And as we mentioned back at the start, the Richard Branson quote, look after your people, they'll look after your customers and your patients. Are your teams able to raise concerns, ask questions, offer ideas and suggestions? For example, what's your incident reporting system used for? Is it to blame others, or is it to genuinely learn from? When I worked with an organisation called the Virginia Mason Institute in Seattle in the States, they created an environment where incident reporting went through the roof, but still ideas for improvement to get on top of some of those incidents, those came from the people who did the work. Staff very much felt they were able to report because they felt the fault lay rarely with them, but with the systems and the processes that they work in. But above all, they felt they had the ability to speak up. I want to share with you quite a famous, well-known case to demonstrate some of the examples of psychological safety in the workplace. And it really is where psychological safety links with the wider human factors awareness. And many of you are probably aware of this case. And it's the case of Elaine Bromley. So Elaine went in for routine elective nasal procedure, fit and well 37-year-old, normal airway assessment in pre-op. In theatre, post-anaesthetic, she experienced unexpected oxygen saturation difficulties, and there was a really prolonged attempt to secure that airway. It actually went on for 40 minutes. Elaine suffered catastrophic brain damage, and Elaine died 13 days later in ITU from irreversible hypoxic brain injury. And the report, when the investigation was complete and the report that came out, and I've left the link on the slide here, you can put this up to learn a lot more about this particular case. It became apparent that the clinicians appeared to become oblivious to the passing of time. So the clinicians here were the anaesthetists, the surgeons. The theatre nurses' suggestions to perform a tracheostomy and admit the patient to ITU weren't acknowledged, but by the same token, the nurse also didn't feel able to repeat that and push it and raise their concerns. ITU bed was made available, and the clinicians again were made aware, but again the team didn't feel they were able to push that. And due to the status and seniority of the clinicians, the theatre team did not feel able to raise concerns or challenge in that environment, despite what was playing out in front of them, despite the seriousness of the situation they found themselves in. So put yourself in the shoes of any member of that team on that day. What were your immediate feelings? How much do you have felt in the days and weeks, even months following? What psychological damage has occurred as a result of feeling that you can't speak up despite what's going on in front of you? Maybe put your thoughts in the chat as well, what your thoughts might be around that. Remember, these aren't bad people. None of the teams set out that day to harm any of their patients. They didn't set out to think we're just going to do a really bad job today. This is the environment that has been created. So clearly, that was not a safe working environment, psychologically safe working environment. And to turn Edmondson's quote around the belief that one will be punished or humiliated for speaking up with ideas, questions or concerns, and the team is not safe for interpersonal risk taking. But our gaze sometimes focuses on those most serious of cases. Go back to one. Those most serious of cases, and we focus on the most serious injury, and we find ourselves losing sight of the many other incidences that may occur as a result of the environment that we've created. Heinrich's safety triangle here is created in the 1930s, but and more recently we now know that these numbers reflect broad indicative kind of ratios between the single serious injury and the many unsafe acts that exist underneath. But what we risk is, in a psychologically unsafe environment, we know that the most serious things, they're the ones that strike us and become our attention. But there are many other incidences and near misses, and unsafe acts and behaviours and conditions that exist. And these underlying unsafe acts, behaviours and conditions are possibly the biggest percentage of injury causing potential in our environment. So psychological safety has a direct impact on patient outcomes. And Pete, of these, then we find that it's the behaviours that have the greatest influence.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. So, the people side of it does, and some of you will have heard of the brilliant campaign by Dr. Chris Turner from who's an ED consultant in Coventry about the Civility Saves Lives campaigns. And I always think the startling facts when work environments have incivility are really quite worrying. So 80% of recipients lose time worrying about the rudeness, 38% reduce the quality of their work, 48% reduce their time of work. So basically, lack of civility leads to really poor and dangerous patient care, but it also affects the service users, the patients, and the people who witness it. So it affects everyone. And I think that's one of the key themes going through psychological safety is civility. It's not about being super nice, because that's not what psychological safety is about, but civility is important. Let me just make sure my slides move. So Nick mentioned this research. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about a few examples, healthcare examples, and examples from other industries as well, and then talk about, what are the things that we can all do and leaders and managers can do. So Nick talked about this study. This was really when the term psychological safety was coined by Professor Amy Edmondson, and she called it an intelligent failure. So she was doing this research. This is 25 years ago, 1999. And the question was, does better teamwork in hospitals lead to fewer errors? So was there a correlation between error rates and really effective teams? And what they found was actually there was a statistically significant correlation, but it was in the wrong direction. So the least effective teams made the least mistakes, and the most effective teams made the most mistakes looking at the data. So she talked to her research supervisor, and they added an extra question in, which was, if you made a mistake on your unit, would it be held against you? And she got a guy to do a double-blind check on this. And then there was a eureka moment. And what they found was better teams probably don't make more mistakes, but they are more able to discuss mistakes, and hence this sort of birth of the term psychological safety, but importantly based on lots of previous work from the people that Nick's talked about, such as Edgar Schein and people like that. And I like this, well, I don't like it, but it just rings true. For me, as a sort of an ex-critical care nurse many years ago, for example, a nurse in one team explained matter-of-factly, mistakes are serious because of the toxicity of the drugs we use, so you're never afraid to tell the nurse manager. In contrast, a nurse in another team in the same hospital reported, you get put on trial. People get blamed for mistakes you don't want to have made one. So that's where the sort of term and the study and the example of where the term psychological safety came from. And then this is a really well-known project. So everyone uses Google. You got a problem, let's Google it. And this project was called Project Aristotle. So a famous quote from Aristotle was, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. And the purpose was, what makes a really good, successful team? So remember, Google has lots of resources available to it. So they looked at, half a century of studies. They looked at all sorts of things. Is it, do you have to have bright people? Do you have to have people with the same interest? Do you have people who have, similar hobbies or being similar educational backgrounds? They looked at 180 teams and they couldn't find anything. For example, teams which on paper looked identical, made up, of the same type of people, differed in their levels of effectiveness. And group norms for some teams appeared to be important, but for others, less so. And along the way, they did various little tests with the teams in Google. So, for example, one was splitting the teams into, to look at who could make up innovative ways to use a brick. And some teams came up with loads of ways. Other teams kept just basically suggesting the same idea, but using different language. Another assignment was you get given a set of groceries and you've got to build the ideal trolley of groceries. And there was one team who just shared, but one of the things you had to do was give up your favorite grocery. one team were happy to give up their favorite grocery for the greater good of the team, and the other team said, well, I'm not giving up my banana or my, protein powder or my slice of bread or whatever. So lots of that, and it still wasn't 100% clear, because some higher performing teams had lots of smart people who worked out to split the work evenly, but some high performing teams had average people, but they knew how to take advantage of everyone's strengths. Some had a really strong leader, others had more distributed leadership. But on the higher performing teams, what they spotted was all people spoke in relative proportion by the end of the day. If only one person or a few people spoke, the collective intelligence declined. And that reminds me of a lot of NHS meetings I've been in. You know, those meetings where someone is just talking and talking, and you feel like saying, well, I won't repeat what you feel like saying on here, but you know what I mean. And then they came across psychological safety, and it was a real light bulb moment for them. And the evidence behind psychological safety is huge. And then things fell into place. And this is what they found with Project Aristotle. They found the 5 things were important, but by far the biggest one, the lever for higher performance and improvement, was psychological safety. Impact, team members thinking that their work matters, meaning, structure and clarity, so everyone's clear about their roles and their goals. Dependability, things get done on time, but the biggest one was psychological safety. Google have taken on those things, so that's a really good set of evidence, really. And then this is a less good example. So everyone will be familiar with the automotive manufacturer VW. And in 2015, there was something called Dieselgate. So the background to it, VW were trying to really ramp up their US market with their diesel cars, things like the Jetta and the Golf and the Audi and things like that. And what they found was, so in order to get your car through a test, it had to get through the US test. It had to have a certain level of emissions, but actually VW's emissions were 40% higher. So, not only is that bad for the environment, it's going to cause people health problems, etc. But what VW did is they fitted defeat devices. So somewhere in the vehicle, it would automatically know when the vehicle was being tested, and then it would flick it into a different mode. So emissions, so it's basically a cheat device, so you could get it onto the market, and there were thousands of vehicles sold. So it's a really good example, well, a bad example. Huge pressure, low psychological safety, no one spoke up, and the message in VW was get it done and get it done now. And Martin Winterkorn was the chief exec at the time. So your natural assumption, a bit like we do in the NHS, is like sack the chief executive. But what was the cause? So I suppose no one will ever know. But if you work it back through the CEO, the one before Martin Winterkorn, the one before that, right back to when Porsche took over VW, and they have the majority shares in VW, so they're a very controlling force. But even back to the Henry Ford days, when the Germans went out to America, when in those days you could be a bit more authoritarian, it just doesn't work these days. There are probably multiple reasons, but that's an example of very poor psychological safety. But what I really like is this letter from a supervisory board member, Bernard Osterloh, in 2015, which sums up, what VW needed to do. And it's a letter to all their staff members. We need in future a climate in which problems aren't hidden but can be openly communicated to superiors. We need a culture in which it's possible and permissible to argue with your superior about the best way to go. So you go from this terrible example to actually quite a good example of saying we need to make it safe for people to speak up. And as Nick said before, most people aren't bad, but put people in the wrong environment, and people behave in a certain way. Now this is a better example. So Pixar animation, so everyone will be familiar with Pixar, and Pixar are linked with Disney now, they're amalgamated. So one of the things that they did was when they were doing Toy Story 2, so unless you were born, I don't know, under a rock or something, you'd have heard of the Toy Story animation films, which were absolutely brilliant. It wasn't going really well. So Ed Catmull, who's one of the co-founders of Pixar, decided to get a group of directors and storytellers to watch early cuts of the movie, and they'd go away for a day or so. And that's when the Brain Trust started. And the rules were this, and are this. Feedback must be constructive and focus only on the project, not on the people. The filmmakers need to be open to hearing the truth and have a tough skin not to take the criticism personally. But at the end of the day, the director, he or she, has the final say, and that takes ego out of it. The director is responsible for the film regardless. So the Brain Trust has no authority. It is, about making suggestions. Although if the director is deemed not to ever take any of the recommendations from the Brain Trust, that may be, moving towards, I don't know, getting the sack or something. But they put the Brain Trust, that as part of their success. And Andrew Stanton, one of the directors of Pixar, compared it to a hospital. So if Pixar is a hospital and the movies are the patients, then the Brain Trust is made up of trusted doctors. It's as if they've gathered a panel of consulting experts to help find an accurate diagnosis for an extremely confounding case. But ultimately, it's the filmmakers, no one else, will make the final decisions about the wisest course of treatment. You could make a comparison to a healthy peer review and so on. So so we've had the VW example, poor example, Pixar good example, and then this isn't specifically psychological safety, but I thought me and Nick thought we'd sort of present it because it's of interest. So one of the things I recently did was, and the reason for stirring this up in me is, in my previous role in ESIS, I seem to travel all over the country and a bit further afield at times, so to places like Saudi Arabia and Canada. And it's amazing how similar things are in all healthcare organisations. But one thing that always got me was the performance seemed to be better on all sorts of levels when the staff were clearer in their roles, when they were happier, when they could raise the flag about certain things. So what I did was I took the 2023 English NHS Staff Satisfaction Survey results, and then I took the English 95% ED performance results. And I chunked the ED performance, which is on the horizontal line at the bottom, into 5% chunks. And what I was looking for was patterns, not to create some great discovery, but it was just based on one of my hunches as having been around healthcare for more years than I sort of care to think. So, for example, with this question, am I trusted to do my job? And you can see the pattern. So the higher performers on the staff satisfaction survey, which has quite a healthy rate of completion, it's higher in the organisations with a higher 95% delivery. We work well as a team. You can see the pattern is the same. Those organisations with better performance tend to say they work well as a team. And importantly, this wasn't just the ED, because we all know that the cause of flow out of ED or around ED isn't just around ED, it's about flow through the system. So this is using the ED measures as the canary in the mine. And for the other ones as well, so, freedom to act and improve, which really you can feel the link to psychological safety there. Freedom to do stuff is higher in those organisations, and the level of frustration is higher in the lower performing organisations. So I thought that was simple, and I've written a brief blog on that, which really happy to share, which seemed to resonate with a lot of people. So there's some examples, but how do you create psychological safety? So there's a few things. One is setting the stage, really framing the stage, be clear that everyone's perspective is important and needs to be heard, and reframing the role of the boss. And I'll come back to that in a second. So one is setting the stage. The other thing is about inviting participation in a humble and a situational way, and being very, very curious. So questions like this: I'm not sure of the best way to proceed. What do you think? What concerns do you have about what's being proposed? What might we be missing? I'm curious about how you come to that decision. How might we do this even better? So, for example, if you're a leader and we rag plans by red, amber and green, in my experience, junior managers, if they're coming to a meeting, want to please the boss, so it's typically a sea of green, and you just think that's just nonsense. Let's have the glorious red, because I don't want to know that everything's great, but what the boss's role should be doing is, what are the things that aren't going so well and we can help you with. And an example at the bottom of the cartoon is pure non-psychological safety, before I give my project support, I want to tell you that Ted's fired. You know, why was your project late? Well, it's Ted's fault. And it might seem extreme, but I have to be honest with you, I've seen examples like that in my time around healthcare. So, and then the next thing about creating psychological safety is responding productively. So express appreciation whether the comment or idea is a good one, a bad, or indifferent. And because too often, you know, the leader of the meeting will go, oh, it's just stupid, that will never work. Whereas we all know the greatest innovations sometimes come from those, you know, wacky ideas, and dare I say it, from the people actually doing the job. And sort of to destigmatize intelligent failure, which, you know, if you're doing improvement properly, yeah, it has to have failure. You know, when Dyson, you know, created his Hoover, he had multiple failures, but also managing clear violations. So psychological safety, which I'm going to come to some of the common questions around it, isn't around, you know, if someone has poor behavior and poor performance at work, that needs to be dealt with, and it needs to be dealt with swiftly, honestly, and civilly. But, you know, one of the things psychological safety isn't a love fest. It isn't about, oh, let's all have a nice hugging and hug some trees. It's not about that. My clicker isn't. Oh, hang on, let me just go back a bit. So other useful phrases: I don't know, I need help, I'm sorry. You know, for leaders, they're all expressions of vulnerability. Removing your mask helps. And by being vulnerable as well as interested, the likelihood is people are probably going to be interested. So here's some common questions: can you have too much psychological safety? And I think this is really pertinent to the NHS and some of my recent conversations, you know, which sometimes go along the line. You do love this stuff, don't you, Pete? Well, actually, no, what I really like is really good performance. That could be operational performance, safety, staff satisfaction, all that type of thing. Yeah, you do love this soft stuff. This isn't about being soft. So one of the common concerns is, well, people talk and talk. Will there be you know, that sea of chatter, derail projects, good ideas lost, and will people be sloppy? Well, you can't have too much psychological safety, but what you can have is not enough discipline. So again, psychological safety isn't about being nice. It's about reducing fear. It's about acting with candor. It's about making it less heroic to ask a question. When Nick was presenting, I was looking at the comments in the chat, and not one of them was a surprise, really. You know, it's almost that fear of being able to put your hand up in a meeting and say, oh, I've got an idea. I mean, what it doesn't mean is you've got a great strategy and the work will get done, and it doesn't mean everyone's is motivated and well trained. And, you know, interpersonal fear is never good. And fear of your boss and speaking up is never great. You'll always get it a bit, but if you're genuinely scared, means you're going to hold back on stuff. Other questions: what about people talking too much if we're going to be psychologically safe? Well, no, that's not good either. You know, those people who just consistently waffle in meetings, they need some feedback about that. And it's also not the panacea. So, you know, when Nick was starting off, he was talking, it's about one of the foundations for good quality continuous improvement. It's an enabler to influence how the work gets done and encourage confidence, diversity, talent, and thought. And, you know, if you really think about it in your roles within the health service, it's usually rare that people focus and encourage more voice and speaking up. They're a rarity. We suddenly go, wow, this is a great organization. People are allowed to talk and give ideas. And we go, oh, this is really good. Let's do a case study on it and put it in some PowerPoint slides and that type of stuff. That will change the world. So it's rarer than you think, because everyone will go, well, you can't do that. And will it take too much time? Will meetings go on and on and on? Well, that's confusing psychological safety with bad processes and bad leadership and management. Managing meetings is a skill and a discipline, you know, to keep people on task. In theory, it should save time and be more efficient. You know, instead of having these decisions where we say we're going to roll that action onto the next meeting and then we're going to roll that onto the next, you know, to the next month. You should be able to resolve things in hours if you've got psychological safety. You know, and do we have to be transparent about everything? Well, no, not if there's a good reason to. You know, in Nick's example, the the Bromley case, where that poor 37-year-old woman died unnecessarily, that should have had true transparency and true psychological safety. But if you're dealing with someone's attire that they're coming to work, dressed really inappropriately, that's not something to be that's something about to deal with the person. But the bottom line is most of us would prefer to work in an environment where we feel psychologically safe. And remember, the fact is, whether we like it or not, hierarchy naturally causes fear. Now, we have to have a hierarchy. So Nick and I aren't saying you can't have a hierarchy. Of course you have. But the research shows that people constantly assess their relative status, monitoring mostly subconsciously how they stack up against others. So those in lower status in a hierarchy experience stress in the presence of those with higher status. So hierarchy, if it's unmanaged, naturally gives rise to fear. And you could probably all reflect or give an example about your worst example of hierarchy and fear if you want in the chat. You don't have to. But leaders at any level can find ways to engage people by reducing their fear. So I think one of the roles of the leader is to reduce fear, to create that psychological safety. Because fear is not a great motivator. Now, it will be, we're really focusing in on healthcare here. So, it may be, in the military or something like that. But research in neuroscience shows that fear diverts cognitive resources from parts of the brain that manage working memory and process new information. And that actually has an impact on analytical thinking, creative insight, and solving problems. So basically improving. So once you have fear, I don't know, I've done lots of jobs. And when I've been in fear, I've done a couple of things. Usually I've left, if I can be really honest with you. But one of the things I do is I shut up because you think, well, I'm going to use my head here. And all those things, those neuroscientific things are happening, and it's sending me to be quiet. So people can't do their best work if they're afraid. And interpersonal fear reduces employees' propensity to engage in learning, sharing, discussing mistakes, and sort of experimenting. So, another question is, but are you just sacrificing performance standards with this lovely psychological safety stuff? Well, of course you're not. It's a matter of finding the right point in the balance beam. It's one of the elements, but it's one of the elements that Nick and I think is lacking. And there are no magic bullets out there. Perfect's the enemy of good. We're not selling this. I mean, basically, it's not our work, so we can't really be selling it. It's not perfection, but it's something which could definitely be improved. So it's about getting the right amount of balance. And a good place to start is you can actually measure it. So these 7 questions, I won't repeat them all. I'll just maybe talk about the first one. If you make a mistake on your team, is it held against you? And, those 7 questions on a Likert scale, one of those horizontal scales, you can come up with a psychological safety index. So you could do it within your team, within your organization, preferably anonymously, and then it would give you a benchmark. It's quite a good way to start. But of course, if you're going to do it, then you have to do something about it. Just measuring stuff and just, doing that doesn't doesn't improve stuff. So just finishing off now. So, the pictures at the top, I don't know if anyone in the chat, maybe just put yes if you can relate to these examples. So the one on the left, anyone else have a new idea they'd like to share? And you've got the guy in the sort of set of stocks. So, of course, no one really has a good idea to share. I can relate to that one. And I love the one on the right, which is, 6 white middle-aged guys. And the one at the front is saying, all those in favour say aye, aye. And of course, they're all saying, yes, yes, aye, aye. But of course, in their heads, they're saying, it definitely isn't. Perish the thought, heaven forbid. No, 1,000 times no. So if you can relate to those examples, then you'd say, well, there's a real opportunity here, isn't there, to do something about it? And imagine this, if you knew that there was someone in your team or organisation had an idea that would improve performance, whether that's safety, whether that's staff satisfaction, whether that's operational standards by 50%, would you want to know about it?